Well, good afternoon. I'm going to ask if our guests will make their way to their seat. And I want to tell you how grateful we are to have this symposium, key Christian book symposium here for our School of Ministry. My name is Ron Smith, and since January 1, I've been serving as president here. And it's a joy to meet you, and it's a joy to gather around such a vibrant Christian concept as the relationship between faith and works. It's been one of the most widely discussed topics in Christendom, I'm sure of that, and yet strangely silent for the 20th century. We just thought it would be a great idea to have some of our best writers across the Wesleyan tradition that also have taught in the Reformed traditions to handle such a topic that can enrich the lives of the church. And so we're grateful. That's what we have ahead of us today. I also want to say, I can't see because of the spotlights, but I think Dr. John Oswald is in the house. And John inevitably is one of the five most mentioned scholars in Wesleyan circles for the Old Testament, and he's been a vibrant speaker in our midst. I wish I could have shared with each of you how sacred the setting has been right here. We just put in here an old camp meeting altar because when John was coming to speak, we wanted to give him a chance to invite students to come and pray, but the altars were filled with students all week. And after two of our students that were recruited for athletics that had never made a profession of faith in Christ accepted Christ in the morning, in the afternoon they went to the YMCA, and the students with them and the leaders had a baptism service. And the leader of the YMCA said it was one of the most spiritually moving times of his life to be standing in the halls of the YMCA singing praises to God, and then hearing the testimonies of these two young women who have made a profession of faith in Christ. So it's been a great week, and we're glad you come. You're like icing on the top of the cupcake, you know, to have pastors who are willing to come and join us at Ohio Christian University for a great books topic. And thank you for being here. I'm going to say a prayer, and then I want to introduce somebody from the State House Company, the Center for Christian Virtue, are going to come. Chris Lightfoot, he's the executive director at the center in Columbus, Ohio. And on Friday, they're having their massive Right to Life campaign and also the state prayer breakfast. I believe Alistair Begg is going to be speaking at the state prayer meeting, and we're going to be participating in that. But I wanted Chris to have an opportunity to greet you as pastors, and he says he's got 3 minutes of information he wants to share about an ultimate article that's facing us for vote, and I said, let's do it. Let's do it together. Let's lean in on the greatest pathway we can find. And so, unapologetically, I give him 3 minutes in behalf of our issues in the state of Ohio. Chris, good to have you. Come on up and take the mic. While he's doing that, I'm going to introduce 3 scholars. All of them have something in common, even with me, and that is at one time or another in our life, we were all at Wesley Biblical Seminary in Jackson, Mississippi. This is Dr. Tom McCall. I was at Theosis, the World Conference on Theosis in Manhattan, New York. I was sitting with about 50 people, and a Roman Catholic said, one of these guys that I keep reading is a Wesleyan scholar, but he's teaching at Trinity, and that's not loaded with Wesleyan scholars. And he asked if anybody knew anything about him. But I didn't want to incriminate Tom, so I just sat quietly. But the late Dr. Billy Abraham stood up and said, well, I don't know why that guy's not saying anything, because they are from the same school. And for 12 years, it was my privilege to work at Wesley Biblical Seminary while these men were coming through. Dr. Tom McCall, it was said by the late Billy Abraham, and I'm quoting, is the most decorated author of Wesleyan systematic theology. And he said you could probably take Wesleyan off of it, but certainly he is a Wesleyan in the entire world today. And I think that's because Billy Abraham is a great reader of journal articles, and Tom has whole notebooks full of the journal articles he wrote after his long tenure at Trinity Evangelical Divinity Seminary. He now serves as the distinguished chair of systematic theology at Asbury Theological Seminary. He's a dear friend. We have a very important meeting every so often. We meet for breakfast at the Dixie Cafe in Keene, Kentucky. Anybody ever heard of that? Anyway, that's where we meet. Caleb Friedemann is the oldest son of the gentleman next to him, is Dr. Matt Friedemann. But Caleb Friedemann is our distinguished scholar here at Ohio Christian University. He's the research professor of New Testament studies. He's the research associate professor at New Testament studies. That has to do with his longevity at the institution, not his inability to be the full professor. He'll be that soon. But he's been well published and making such a stride in our world. His first book was picked up by Cambridge University Press, which is no slight accomplishment. He's a well-equipped man and a wonderful Christian brother to our students and leader at Ohio Christian University. And Dr. Matt Friedemann is a professor of evangelism. He sits in the distinguished chair of the John C. Case. And is it Martin or just John C. Case? Oh, John M. Case, that's right. John Morrison Case, named after Dr. Henry Clay Morrison from the Asbury Seminary Foundation. He was the founder 100 years ago of Asbury Theological Seminary. And so Matt sits in that distinguished chair, and he's a tremendous both academic and practitioner in evangelism, and pastors a church that he planted while working at Wesley Biblical Seminary that I think it's at least one of the top 3 size of Nazarene churches in the state of Mississippi, Dayspring Church. And so, Matt, we're glad to have you here again. And thank you. I don't know if you shared your son with us or he left and departed for a foreign land, but I know this. We're grateful for Caleb Friedemann. He is an anchor to us. You'll hear all of these men momentarily, but before that, Brother Lightfoot is going to share a tremendous issue coming up for Ohioans, and we're going to give him the podium. Would you congratulate him and greet him today?
Thank you, Dr. Smith. All right, I'll keep this planted on my chin so that as I wander around, it doesn't go too far from my face. I wish I had spent more time understanding some of the relational connections here. About 10 weeks ago, I was helping lead the National Christian Foundation for the state of Ohio, and one of our gift planning attorneys, Rachel Watson, is the daughter of Steve and Patty Throckmorton. Patty Maxwell, and the library and the Maxwell Center are named after her grandparents. So that was fun. I was connecting with her on the drive down. My pastor up in Columbus is Aaron Hawley, son of George Hawley, who I think has some ties in the Wesleyan church. I was texting with Tim Throckmorton yesterday in Family Research Council, and Les Crossfield has become a good friend up in Columbus. So all of these things have started to come together, and it's an honor to be here with you all today. So what I wanted to share real quickly, and we've got a table full of resources out behind the doors, and then there's, if you go to ccv.org/vote, all of the resources that you see out there, you can click, request how many you want, and they'll be drop shipped to you for free for whatever purposes you want to use those for. This issue that's coming up, and there are actually two, I'm going to focus on the abortion amendment to the Constitution, but these issues that are coming up in November are a big deal for our state. And I appreciate having a few minutes to address this. First of all, well, and actually, let me address the pastor's breakfast with Alistair Begg on Friday as well, because I know we have a number of students coming up from Ohio Christian to help us with that. In fact, they're going to get to hear Pastor Begg because they're going to be in the room with us at the State House in some volunteer capacities before they go out and do some things at the march as well. We do still have some seats left for that. This is a week from tomorrow, but if you're interested, let me know. Maybe you can just put your name on the clipboard and write Pastor's Breakfast next to that, and we'll make sure we get you that information so you can register. Or you can go onto the website, ccv.org/breakfast. Keep it easy. All right. Key points on this issue 1 coming up in November. First of all, it's important to understand that this is a constitutional amendment, not a bill. The reason that's important is that if this passes as a constitutional amendment, it trumps all existing law in the state of Ohio. Governor DeWine and CCV have done a lot of work over the last couple decades to restrict the abortion industry. And a lot of that has just been common sense stuff, holding abortion centers to the same levels as other surgical centers from an accountability standpoint. You can't have doorways that are too narrow for a gurney. You got to have some contingency plans in case a woman who's in surgery begins to have issues. These were common sense things that shut down a number of abortion centers in the state because they did not meet code. Well, that's a law that's on the books. A constitutional amendment that says the state shall not directly or indirectly burden a woman's access to abortion. All of a sudden, all of those existing laws on the books have now been superseded. And we're seeing that in Michigan, right? Prop 3 passed a year ago. If you've been tracking what's going on in Michigan, they're very quickly now attacking all of the existing laws on the books, repealing all of those laws to expand abortion as quickly as possible in the state of Michigan. We got to be aware that this is constitutional, not just another statute. That's a big deal. Number 2, the amendment itself will do 2 things. Number 1, because it's going to trump all the existing statutes, it will remove parental consent for abortion on minors. We get this often. This question always comes up. There's already laws protecting parental consent for surgeries of any kind on a minor. That's correct. As a constitutional amendment, when the amendment says an individual, the word choice in these amendments is critically important and intentional. They chose the word individual so that they could apply it to every individual. That includes minors under the age of 18. We will see parental consent come under attack. So be aware of that. And then number 2, it'll allow abortion up through full term. Even though there is language in the amendment about viability, immediately following that it says, except in the case of the life or health. Well, if you're familiar with the Supreme Court's definition of health, It is extremely broad and intentionally broad to give access to an abortion to for that woman to the abortion through the entire term of the child, through the entire term of the pregnancy. And we know this to be true based on precedent throughout the court's history. So I just wanted you to be aware of those two things. The final piece I'll say is that we've been getting a lot of questions on what can and can't pastors do. It's a political issue, right? What can pastors say? What can pastors not say? Here's the important thing to remember. On ballot issues, you can say whatever you want, and you do not have to give the platform to the opposition. You can't do that with candidates. On a ballot issue, and especially one that is as biblical as the sanctity of life, you can preach on this. You can put the resources in your foyers. You can have we've got churches that are setting up computers to do voter registration in their foyers. That is all within your legal rights. There's a piece of paper out there that looks like this, front and back. We worked with Alliance Defending Freedom to put together a what pastors can and cannot do. Because a lot of times, it's not you that have questions, it's your leadership team. It's somebody else in the congregation who's concerned about, should we be talking about these things? You have full authority legally to have these conversations. I just want to make sure that that's clear. So I'm going to wrap it up with that. Happy to stick around afterwards, have plenty of conversations. The one other piece that I'll draw your attention to is this explainer document. This explainer document has the full amendment text, and then it breaks down the legal interpretation of that text in the areas that are most concerning. That life and health piece and why that expands to a full-term abortion, the individual and why that expands to minors. It goes through all of the legalese on that piece, so you can have that as a resource as well. So I will turn it back over. Thank you for the generosity of your time, and I'm excited to be here for the rest of the day today.
Thank you for coming, and we'll prayerfully support Right. Thank you. Thank you for your generosity of spirit to allow these significant things. And what better than to have somebody come say, why don't you vote and get involved when we're talking about faith and works? That's more than just a light concern. The community of faith out of the salt shaker into the earth, and it's a beautiful thing. Dr. Tom McCall is going to be the first author that is going to address us. Let me talk to you about what's going to happen after that. Each of these three authors that have authored this book are going to come and give a sense of perspective that was driving their heart in being involved with this great work. And after they present, we're going to have a time of a discussion. So we'll have some time for questions and things, and I've already collected some from people in the audience already, but you certainly will have an opportunity. If you have a question, I'd be glad to recognize you as well. So there's going to be time for interaction. So don't let this be such a formal setting on this platform that we don't feel like this can be a heart-to-heart conversational thing that would be a discussion that's helpful to you in your ministry and walk. Dr. McCall, thank you for coming, and the Lord bless you. Won't you welcome Dr. Tom McCall to the platform?
Well, thank you, Ron, for the welcome, the warm welcome, and the invitation. Thanks to all of you for being here, for your interest in this topic and in the work that we've tried to do on this topic. There's obviously a great deal more to be done, both theoretically, but obviously practically and pastorally. And we're under no illusions that we've answered all questions or done all the work. We've only begun to think a bit harder and longer about some of the issues that need due attention, and we've tried to address these things in such a way as to encourage us to move forward in faith, hope, and love. I think it's no crisis, I'm not telling you anything you don't know when I say that Christianity in North America is in somewhat of a state of crisis in many ways. And there are multiple reasons for that, various causes for that. And I certainly wouldn't want to offer a quick and oversimplified account of that. But I do think that some of that crisis has been either precipitated or accelerated by the issue before us today. We are told in Scripture forcefully and repeatedly that what we do matters. That faith without works is dead. That we are created in Christ Jesus to do good works. We're saved for these works. And when people who are already dealing with, sometimes harboring, sometimes intrigued by, sometimes worried by, skeptical arguments against the sort of rational foundations of the Christian faith, when people are already in a context where those are live questions, and then they see Christians who say one thing and do nothing, or say one thing and do another, they're almost immediately turned off. Peter exhorts us to be prepared to offer a reason for the hope that is within us. Notice that his exhortation is about having a response or an answer, which presupposes a question, which I think in the context is called for precisely by something different: hope. My point is that people are not likely to find our arguments compelling if they don't find the faith attractive in the first place. And they're not likely to find our Christian testimony compelling or even plausible if our lives are not winsome, if our witness is not winsome. And so I was wrestling with these issues from a theological and pastoral set of concerns. At the same time, in some of my academic work, I've worked in late medieval through early modern scholasticism, particularly in the Protestant versions of it. And in that study, I was seeing something that surprised me repeatedly and sometimes just shocked me. There were places where I would stop and reread a statement 2 or 3 times, reread the context again. Why? Because it was so different than what even I had come to expect. If you ask many Western, and I think especially North American Christians today, if good works are necessary for salvation, I think you're likely to get a particular kind of response. It's going to be fairly predictable. It's sometimes going to be forceful. The answer is, if we ask, what must I do to be saved? In other words, are good works at all part of what's going on? Are good works in any way necessary for salvation? A common contemporary evangelical answer is going to be no. And sometimes it's going to be followed by warnings. Good works are seen as irrelevant to the gospel, right? The good news. Or at most, something that just follows from salvation. Good works at best are seen as a sort of add-on to the real gospel. And good works are often seen as worse than that, as actually dangerous to the Christian faith. You say good works in a lot of contemporary North American evangelical Christian context, and what you'll get is, oh no, we don't believe in that. We believe in salvation by grace through faith. Many people who say that will then defend that by pushing hard and saying, and we believe this because we're Protestant or because we're Reformed. So as I'm reading, I'm hearing that, aware of this crisis within our culture, and also at the same time reading these early modern scholastic texts. And here I'm seeing the Reformed, as well as the Lutherans and the Anglicans and the Wesleyans and others, who say something very different. Are good works necessary for salvation? The standard Protestant answer in the 16th and 17th centuries is yes, of course. Francis Turretin, one of the leading Reformed scholastics of the era, it faces this question directly. He asks, are good works necessary for salvation? He does not hesitate. We affirm. Do you hear that? We affirm. This isn't from the Roman Catholic critics of evangelical or Protestant thought. This is from one of the main leaders of the Reformed movement. Are good works necessary for salvation? We affirm. So I was intrigued by this, and so I began to dig further and dig deeper and look more broadly. And what I found was that there is common accord across these different theologians, from whether they be Dutch or British or French or German or Swiss, later American. Across Lutheran and Anglican and Reformed traditions, what I keep seeing is this insistence that good works are necessary for the Christian life. And in many cases, explicitly, good works are necessary to be saved. Now, there's also some disagreement, and some of this is discussed in this book. So it's worth thinking very briefly about. Some of the Reformed, and indeed this is almost universal, will say good works are necessary as the fruit or evidence of salvation. We're nearing harvest season. We're already harvesting some things. All my friends in Alaska, where I used to live, are picking blueberries and low bush cranberries and showing me these pictures that drive me crazy. It's that time of year, right? You want to know what kind of tree something is? What do? You look at the fruit. You want to know if a tree is healthy? What do? You look at the fruit. And so many of the Reformed, virtually all of the Reformed, will say that good works are necessary as the fruit or evidence of salvation. They show who and what we are. But other of the Reformed will go further. So many of the Reformed will say that good works are actually a means or a medium for receiving salvation. Thus, Henry Compton, one of the Englishmen, says this. It's agreed, he says. This is uniform across our faith, he says, that a virtuous and holy life is necessary to salvation. And here's the distinction. Not as giving us a right, so we're not earning it by our good works. There's no sense in which we are accruing merit, gaining enough good stuff points with God, but as the necessary means to obtain that right. One of the illustrations that shows up in this literature is that of someone who lives in one city, and the cities will vary depending on which country they're writing this in, who lives in one city, who receives an inheritance in another city. So Johannes Valabius talks about the Genevan who inherits a gift in Basel. It is a gift. There is no sense in which it is earned. There is no room for boasting. You can't claim that you've done so much and you've been so good and you've handled your money so well and you've worked so hard that you now deserve this inheritance. It's utterly gratuitous. It is a gift. But guess what? This gift in Basel that's given to the person from Geneva does not belong to the Genevan and does the Genevan no good unless he gets up and goes to Basel. And good works are the road one travels between Geneva and Basel. Or for the English, they'll use, other cities. I'm trying to be as clear as I can be. None of these thinkers believe that good works are brownie points, good stuff points you accrue with God. In no sense is there merit. In no sense is there earning a right to be saved. Salvation is an utterly gratuitous gift. But make no mistake, it is a gift that must be received, and the way one receives it is by love of God and love of neighbor. Other Reformed go yet further. So some will say that good works, they'll spell it out this way, a condition of salvation. Heinrich Alstead refers to good works as a condition sine qua non, that is, without which none, without which nothing. So everyone, virtually everyone, agrees that they are the fruit or evidence of being saved, so they're necessary in that sense. As I've said, others go further and look at it as the means or medium by which we receive what God gives. Heinrich Alstead, as I've said, and others go further yet and refer to this as a condition that must be met. Some Reformed go even further and will talk about good works as a cause of salvation. I'm going to just let that sink in and say that again. Good works for the Reformed as well as the Roman Catholics and the Anglicans and the Wesleyans and all the others. Good works are, strictly speaking, a cause of salvation. Now, they'll disagree among themselves as to which kind of cause this is. And no one thinks that this is something, and no one should think, that this is something that we initiate or that we do to somehow impress God so that God might be disposed to look graciously upon us. In no sense is this earning our salvation. This is only and always receiving. But it's receiving in a way that cooperates with what God is doing. And their point is that when God saves us, God so changes us that we truly begin to love God with our whole heart, mind, and strength, and truly love our neighbors as ourselves. That then finds its expression in works of piety, that is genuine worship, and works of mercy, charity, and justice with our neighbors. And these are, for some of the Reformed, not all, but some of the Reformed, nothing less than actually a cause of salvation. The English theologian John Davenant, who was the British prolocutor, the head honcho of the British delegation to the Synod of Dort that pushed the Arminians right out of the Netherlands, right out of the Protestant faith. John Davenant, the leader of the British group that was sent there, he says this: it is impossible, he says, to reach the goal of salvation when the pursuit of good works is altogether evaded and rejected, when a loose rein is given to the lust after evil works. He's faced with this question: what happens when someone leaves the highway he calls of good works? What happens when someone leaves the road that God has called us to walk? He says, when we are walking this other bypath, he says, they are proceeding straight to hell. So good works for the Reformed, Lutherans, Anglicans, and others are not meritorious. Let's be very clear about that. I want to be as clear as I can be. These are not a way of earning salvation. This is not a way of earning favor before God with hopes that God might be then disposed to look graciously upon us. Salvation is of the Lord. Salvation is always of grace. And at the same time, good works indeed are necessary for salvation. Earlier I mentioned the Reformed theologian Francis Turretin. He spells it out further in this way. He said, good works can be considered in three ways: with respect to justification, or with respect to sanctification, or with respect to glorification. Notice he says they are related to justification. He says not antecedently, efficiently, and meritoriously, but consequently and declarative. That's a mouthful. Let's just think about that for just a moment together. They're not related to justification antecedently. That is, they do not come before and make our justification possible. They're not related efficiently. That is, they don't cause it to happen. They certainly do not earn merit or standing before God. They come consequently. That is, with and after God's gracious decision to justify us by his grace. and they are declarative. That is, they are the witness, the sign, the testimony that God indeed has done this in and for us. I think that part of the problem today with a lot of contemporary Christianity is that we've reduced our understanding of salvation to justification. That is, salvation is mostly about your legal status being changed, and the good news is mostly or solely about what happens to you after you're dead. This is not historic Christianity. It's not historic Protestant Christianity. It's not historic Reformed and Lutheran theology. Here's a Reformed thinker, more Reformed than which is hard to conceive, who says that good works are necessary for salvation, not for justification per se. They declare the fact that we've been justified. Moving forward, he says, with respect to glorification, they are, he says, antecedent to it. But with respect to sanctification, he says, God's ongoing work of cleansing and reforming and changing us, good works are related to sanctification constitutively. That is, God changes us by and through our works of worship and our works of service. Indeed, some of the Reformed will say that good works are not only necessary, but supremely necessary. And the Reformed scholastic Johannes Heidegger says that our sanctification is necessary above all things. We've inherited in a lot of modern American Christianity, I'm afraid we've inherited a skewed and very, very thin and deeply inadequate, in many cases deeply inadequate notion of salvation. Salvation is taken to be supposed to be about legal standing being changed, full stop. And the good news is about what happens after you're dead. The biblical picture, as we'll explore with Caleb in a moment, I believe is much richer and deeper and much more beautiful. What I want us to see right now is that we are not the first people to be taking a look at this deeper and broader and richer and more beautiful picture of salvation. Our own Protestant forefathers and mothers saw this as well. Thus, with Johannes Heidegger, our sanctification is necessary above all things.
Thank you, Dr. McCall. What I like to do is ask him a question that I think is a little bit loaded based on my own experience. I was at Princeton in the mid-'80s, and of course, I was serving a United Methodist Church. So Wesleyan in perspective, and now I'm at this great bastion of Reformed theology. One of the great Calvinist scholars of the world, Tom, you've heard of him, Dr. Edward Dowie from Princeton. He assigned some people to read in the works of Luther, particularly the reaction against Roman Catholicism's teaching on works. And so he assigned me to read on the topic of the great whore of Babylon. Oh, they're throwing a United Methodist right to the fire there. Just the simple works about why are the Reformed people so upset about the Roman Catholic doctrinal approach where they feel they lead with works. So I said, Dr. Dowie, I don't understand all this fomentation here. Of course, I can't say I understood much at that level. I'd come from a non-Christian home. I now was engaging in theological studies. And here was Dowie's answer. Now, this is Princeton, and you went to some institutions that rivaled Princeton in Reformed thought. Certainly your time at Calvin College was systematic theology. Dr. Dowie said, if they have the gospel backwards and lead with works instead of grace, that's an anti-Christian doctrine which sets up the possibility for the Antichrist to vie for the minds of the people. Therefore, I strongly adhere to the Reformed perspective. I just thought I'd throw you a meatball based on that at Princeton and say, how would you respond to Dr. Dowie in a situation like that? Because after all, is this not the topic you're seeking to address?
So I thank you for that. I do want to make it clear. The reformers understood themselves to be, and the reformers, including both the Reformed and the Lutheran, understood themselves to be taking a very different view than the official Roman Catholic view. Originally, though, I think what they were pushing back against most forcefully was not the official Roman Catholic view. It was the popular Roman Catholic view, at least popular in some parts of late medieval Europe. This is sort of well-known textbook sort of thing, but it is true that you do have in Luther's Germany, in Luther's region of Germany in particular, you have efforts at fundraising aimed at the poor and illiterate folk, the people who could least adjudge what was being told them and least afford to give more. And what you have here is Johann Tetzel and others on this big fundraising campaign selling these indulgences, selling ways, if you haven't done enough good works, you can at least throw money in the coffers and buy enough credit that way. And Luther, his original protest were aimed at this both theologically but also pastorally. The 95 Theses, if you read them, I remember when one of my oldest son was in 7th grade and he had to do a history day project. And so I had him read, he wanted to do something on something. I said, hey, how about Luther? So he reads the 95 Theses. I said, can you summarize this for me? And he looked at me and goes, yeah, he's really mad. And I said, what's he mad about? And he goes, he's really mad that they're misrepresenting God. And he's really mad they're taking care of the poor, that they're taking advantage of the poor people. And it's entirely right. And both of those work together for Luther. And so I think Luther's protest originally weren't trying to build a new church or start something. He was protesting against getting this backwards, but also then what that does. And he was protesting against some of the crudest forms of reversing this order. But to say that, and I can show you the quotes where, you get scholastic Protestants who are saying things like, the view we were protesting against held up works without faith. It would be just as much of an error for us to say faith without works. So they were protesting against something that was genuine, something that actually, in my view, needed to be addressed, something that was terrible, that had both theological roots, but also that went very, very deep, but also had a massive pastoral socio-political consequences, and they were pushing back against that hard. But what they were sensitive to was the concern raised by some of their critics that they were ignoring or downplaying the importance of good works. I mean, Johann Gerhard, who was almost exactly a contemporary of Jacob Arminius, famous Lutheran scholastic, he writes a massive treatise. It's about 500 pages on the doctrine of good works. And almost all that he says there about it is positive. Yes, he's protesting against the abuses of a doctrine of good works, but he's not thereby rejecting a doctrine of good works entirely. In fact, he's laying all this out. This is what good works are. Here's why we should do them. Here's why they're necessary, like I was talking about. He's got all this laid out in great detail, not rejecting it. Thanks.
Okay, one of our theological faculty members read your synthesis and wants to ask this question. If, as you argue, it is such an open and shut case that the Protestant reformers overwhelmingly held that good works are truly good and actually necessary for salvation, when did the shift take place that has resulted in the current evangelical Protestant devaluation of or radical opposition to good works as necessary to salvation?
Yeah, so where does it go bad? Where is this twisted or warped or lost on the timeline? Yeah, so first thing I want to say is it has been, largely. I mean, there are Reformed folk today who know better, but in general understandings of this, and I'm not just saying general understandings, in contemporary textbooks written from broadly evangelical or Reformed Baptist or even confessionally Reformed perspectives, you can look at a book of 1,300 pages of systematic theology and not see a single sustained area where good works are treated. And if you look at index or you just read carefully and you start seeing where it's mentioned, they'll be almost always and almost entirely negative. So it has definitely happened. Timeline, that's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I just know that somewhere between 1700 and 2020, right, there's your range. Right in that narrow window right there, yeah. Now, I mean, I could guess at things, but I don't want to speculate too much. I don't know. I guess, but they would just be guesses.
I can see the next student text on the test. Somewhere between 1700 and 2020, we would like to talk about. No, actually.
Sorry, I will say a little bit more than that. I mean, if you read something like Jonathan Edwards' Religious Affections, there's not a hint of the view, the sort of abuses we see now. Right. I've done this with students before. It's not really fair, but it's kind of fun. Have them have a slideshow just to get a conversation going, right? I've put up a slideshow with a bunch of quotes, and I'll say, guess the theological tradition this comes from. And, I'll throw up a bunch of Edwards slides, and they'll think it's some fire-breathing 19th century holiness movement preacher. I mean, it's this holiness or hell sort of stuff that comes through. So he's writing, it's as much as he has anything to do with it, it's not his fault.
Okay. Well, I'm going to call Dr. Caleb Friedemann, who is a 21st century fire-breathing holiness preacher, and we're going to let him further his perspectives from the book.
So my part in our book is to do the biblical data, and so I was basically given the task of synthesizing what the Bible has to say about the doctrine of good works in 2 chapters or less. And one thing that I think is important to just say at the beginning is that anything that is truly Protestant must also be truly biblical. And a positive doctrine of good works is both. And I think we can see this from a number of angles. I just want to highlight today three big things that have come out in my research, and perhaps even 3 things that I've either learned or become more convicted of while working on this book. In doing biblical theology, one of the things that's really important is synthesizing, right? And often when we do biblical theology, a lot of the contribution is not necessarily in coming up with original readings of individual verses or passages. It's putting the whole thing together in a way that's coherent. And one of the things that I think is really helpful from a biblical theological perspective when it comes to the doctrine of good works is recognizing that good works are part of God's original and final intent for human beings. I think a lot of the time we have this idea that work and works enter the biblical picture in Genesis 3 and following, right? They are a post-fall phenomenon. But that's simply not what we find when we look closely at the first 2 chapters of Scripture. And then if we think about our eternal future, right, many of us also have an idea that, well, we are working now, but we will cease to do work and works once we get to the new heavens and new earth. I think that is also not true. And I want to just briefly highlight some of the reasons I think that good works are part of original and final intent. So, original intent, Genesis 1 and 2. Just 2 quick points here. First off, humans are made in God's image. We all recognize that. What we often forget is that we're made in the image of a working God. When we look at how Genesis 2 summarizes the creative work that's happening in Genesis 1, we find the word work used 3 times in the space of about 2 verses. So Genesis clearly depicts what God is doing across the creation week as being work, and it's good work, and we know that because he keeps saying that it's good, and then ultimately very good as he finishes. But also, God creates man initially to work and keep the garden. Genesis talks about how there is no man to work the garden, and then God creates Adam to fill that role, and Eve then joins him in that calling. And we also know that in Genesis 1, when God creates the first humans, he gives them good work to do, right? Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, subdue it. Those are all good things that God gives humans to do. Now, of course, we move on to the fall, and we find that, yes, we corrupt ourselves when we rebel against God, and that in turn corrupts our relationship to everything that we do. So, yes, the story in Scripture about good works, or about works in general, it's going to be a complicated one, but I think that sort of beginning helps us to realize that God is not going to be attempting to redeem us from work, but to redeem us for work, the good that he has called us to do. So this is what we should expect to find across Scripture. And then, if we read to the end of the story, we also find that good works are part of final intent. And we can see this from a number of points. John includes elements of Eden in the new creation. So, for example, we have the tree of life, but it's not just one tree, it's actually trees of life that are lining this river. The river also, by the way, that's in the new creation, is reminiscent of Eden. And so we're expecting something that is like the original intent, but expanded. John also alludes in describing the new creation to Isaiah 60 and 65, which portray work as a part of the new creation. And I would actually encourage you, after we get done here today, go read those chapters. I think you'll find that good work is actually very central to those visions of the new creation that Isaiah had. And finally, John says that God's people will do 2 things for eternity. We have 2 explicit verbs that we're given: serve and reign. And while serve could just be the kinds of things that we do in a worship service, I think it's more likely that it's broader than that, as Isaiah 60 and 65 would suggest. But also, reigning certainly goes beyond the things that we usually do in a corporate worship service. So we can't just reduce our eternal action to singing, playing harps, and making music on instruments, the things that we do in our worship services. Although I'm sure that will be part of it, it'll be broader than that. So that's one angle to think about. I also, though, talk a good bit in the book about covenants. And I think this is an important element of seeing how good works fit into the picture of Scripture. When we talk about covenants in Scripture, scholars will usually note that there were at least 2 types of covenants in the ancient Near East, and that when the Bible uses covenant language, it's not just sort of inventing this in a vacuum, it's drawing on that conceptual world and then developing it, sometimes even differing from it, but we have these basic covenant types. So one type of covenant that existed in the ancient world was the suzerain vassal treaty, and the Mosaic covenant has parallels to this in terms of its structure. But you also have the royal grant, and scholars will often note that the Abrahamic and Davidic covenants are more similar to the royal grant in terms of their form. Now, some people will also put another layer of interpretation onto that and say that these covenants are conditional and unconditional, respectively. In other words, suzerain vassal treaties, of which the Mosaic covenant is one, are conditional. They expect the people who are involved to do something. And then people will say, well, but the royal grant is unconditional. So therefore, the Abrahamic and Davidic covenants don't expect anything of the human party. God makes these covenants, and he just says, I'm going to do this, and you don't have to do anything. I think a better interpretation, though, starts with recognizing that covenants are mutual agreements. They're mutual oath-bound agreements. And in fact, if we look at the biblical covenants closely, I think we'll see that all of the covenants have conditional elements, right? They might also have unconditional elements. And if I can just take one example of that, people often say the Davidic covenant is completely unconditional. And indeed, if you look at the initial statement of that covenant in 2 Samuel 7, right, when God comes to David after David says that he wants to build God a house, and God says, no, I want to build you a house, right? And then he gives this statement about how he's going to place one of David's descendants on his throne. He's going to reign eternally, those kinds of things. People will say, well, this is clearly an unconditional covenant. And you might be able to just read 2 Samuel 7 and walk away thinking that. I think if you read it closely, you'd see there probably are some conditional elements there. But what's fascinating is if you go to 1 Kings and 2 Kings and read through those, you'll find that the Davidic covenant is restated repeatedly in conditional terms. They will summarize the Davidic covenant by saying something like, God said, if you do this, then this, right? So I think we can see with the Davidic covenant, yes, there are some unconditional elements. God is going to send the Messiah regardless of the human failure, right? He's going to send Jesus no matter what. But the degree to which any individual Davidic king or Israelite is going to participate in the benefits of that covenant depends on their response, right? And that's why we see certain kings enjoying God's favor and God's blessing on their reign, and other ones really missing out because they worship idols. So this idea of conditionality is really, I think, inherent to the notion of covenant. And that's not just true for the Old Testament covenants, that's also true for the New Covenant. One final thing that I want to talk about that gets a good bit of attention in our book is good works in Paul. For many Protestants, Paul is the reason that they think good works can't have anything to do with salvation. They'll say, well, look, the Pauline doctrine of justification by faith means that good works cannot be necessary for salvation, right? We're justified apart from our works. So I want to just talk about this briefly. I do this at much more length in the book, and I'd encourage you to read that. But I want to just begin by asking a question. What makes something a gift? Or what makes something grace? John Barclay, a Pauline scholar, has written what's probably the most important book on Paul that's been published in the last couple decades. It's called Paul and the Gift. And in there, he talks about a number of ways that someone might develop this idea of a gift or of grace. And I just want to talk about two of them today. One of them is incongruity. So one way you might answer that question of what makes something grace is to say that the gift is given without regard for the worth of the recipient. In other words, a true gift is given to someone who doesn't deserve it. If someone does deserve it, that would make it wages, right? Or your pay. You're owed it. And so a true gift then would have to be given without regard for the worth of the recipient. Another way, though, that you could develop the idea of a gift and say, here's what makes something really a gift, is to say, no, it's really about non-circularity. You see, a true gift, someone might say, does not expect a response. It has no strings attached. Now, in our modern world, we often pair these two things. So we'll think to ourselves, okay, a true gift is both given without regard for the worth of the recipient. It's unmerited. But also we'll assume at the same time that a true gift also doesn't expect a response. A true gift, we might think, is one that has no strings attached. What's fascinating, however, is that in Paul's world, reciprocity or circularity was assumed. So that assumption that we have, that true gifts have no strings attached, that is not an assumption that would have been shared by Paul and other people in his world, like the people that received his letters, for example. One of the basic building blocks of the Greco-Roman world was something called the patronage system. It involved two parties, really. The patron and the client. The patron was someone who had more resources, and this was really important in a world where there wasn't really a middle class, right? In the ancient world, it was much more divided. You had a few people at the top that had a lot, and you had a lot of people toward the bottom that had a little, and not a lot of people in the middle. What that meant was, it was important in that world for people who were at the bottom and had a little to be able to make their way in the world by having a relationship with people that had a lot. The people that had a lot, of course, were the clients. And the clients would develop the patrons would develop relationships with clients. And they would give them perhaps their connections, their resources, monetary resources, other kinds of resources. And the patrons were doing all this, but the clients, it wasn't just going to be a non-circular relationship. The clients were expected to also return something, but they didn't have connections. They didn't have money. They didn't have the same resources. What did they have? They had loyalty. They had faithfulness. And this indeed was the expectation. So Paul's whole world revolved around this idea of circular gift giving. And indeed, we find that our New Testament terms for grace, the Greek word charis, that was used both to describe what a patron did toward a client, but also the gratitude and loyalty, sometimes implied loyalty, that the client would return to the patron. And this was so central to Paul's world. It would be like the equivalent to Paul's world of what the internet is for us. It's so ingrained in that world. So what this means is this. And by the way, I teach this now in several of my classes. Whenever we talk about Paul, I'll talk about this. When I even teach a sophomore level New Testament interpretation class, we talk about the patronage system because it's so important and so different from our world. Here's what that means, though, for interpreting Paul. It means that if Paul is going to say that God's gift is non-circular, God's gift has no strings attached, he's going to have to be really, really, really clear about that. And as we look at Paul's letters, what we find is that Paul does affirm the incongruity of God's grace, that God's gift is given to people who do not deserve it. However, what we also find is that Paul also affirms the circularity of grace, that while God gives to those who do not deserve, he also expects a response. And that does not make it not a gift. In fact, that is inherent to the notion of the gift for Paul. And the great news about this for biblical theology is that it means that Paul agrees with Jesus. It also means that Paul agrees with James. We don't have a divide there where Jesus is saying no good works are necessary, like Matthew 25, and Paul saying, nah, don't worry about it. Instead, it's Paul saying, yes, God is giving you something that you do not deserve, that you could not have earned, but yes, you also need to respond to that gift. Just one brief example of how this makes a difference, and I'm done. We often like to quote Paul on grace in Ephesians 2, right? The statement is this: "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing, it is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast." It's very easy in our world to walk away and say, okay, God has given us a free gift. God has done something, and I don't need to do anything. However, what we're assuming at that point is the non-circularity of the gift, which Paul hasn't actually affirmed anywhere in what I've just read. What he's just said is that the gift is incongruous. It's given to people who do not deserve it. We could not have earned it. We cannot earn it. And we need to read the next verse, which we usually don't, because Paul goes on, I think, to affirm the circularity or the reciprocity of the gift. For, he goes on in verse 10, "We are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works." Good works, created for them. Not just created for them, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. And so I think the wonderful thing about biblical theology is that it helps us to see this perspective that reaches across the canon. It helps us to put Paul in proper perspective and to see how Paul actually is saying the same kind of thing that Jesus has been saying, the same thing that we'll find James saying, the same thing that we'll find Revelation saying when it talks about us being judged according to our works. And the message, the biblical message about good works, is good news, because it means that God doesn't just want to change our status, he wants to change us. He wants to make us people who do the good that he has created us to do. And when we do that, we are blessed.
I'm going to let Dr. Pesia, who works in our student body for ministry, take this mic out to you. If you'd like to ask a question, stand up and he'll come to you, and we'll let the congregation here feed back to Brother Caleb.
This will be somewhat directed to both Dr. Caleb Friedemann and Dr. McCall. I think it's on page 22. I think it's Turretin talking about the order of salvation and glorification, and talks about good works being the, the way or means to glorification, or of glorification. And then Dr. Friedemann's first point, that good works are part of God's original and final purpose for man. And I never thought about that in that way, but I'd like to hear some commentary on the idea of good works as being intimately connected to the final step in the order of salvation.
Yeah, I think one thing that's interesting to me, at least on that point, is that if we're looking forward to the end of the story and realize that good works are part of what we'll be doing for eternity, I think that changes how we even perceive the work that we do now. Because it means that when we do the good works that God places before us here in the present, we're actually getting a foretaste of eternity. So when God places someone before me who is in need, in whom I could see the face of Christ, say someone who's in prison, or as we just heard a few moments ago, babies who are still in utero and need someone to contend for them, right? When I do that good that God has placed before me to do, I'm not just kind of doing what I have to do. I mean, maybe I do have to do it, but I'm getting to taste eternity. And I think when we recognize that, it changes how we perceive everything about our lives in the present. It changes the way that we think about the work that God has given us to do on a Monday morning. And instead of seeing Monday morning as a moment to groan and think, one more of these weeks, we get to say, wow, like I get to become the person who gets to learn to enjoy the kind of things that I'll be doing for eternity in the here and now. And of course, eternity will be far better because we'll live in a world without sin, and we'll be with Christ and experience God's presence in a different way. But I think this perspective should change our present significantly.
So thank you, Caleb, for that. I'll just add to that two brief comments. One of them is this. In, I think, a lot of contemporary sort of Christian teaching on these things, as I said earlier, good works are either like a bad thing, or they could be a good thing in the sense that grace gets you saved, but how nice your condo is in heaven is going to be up to how much you do now. So, like, whatever carat quality your street of gold is or whatever, you earn that now. I mean, I can give you receipts on that. People actually say those things. So the rewards, so to speak, are totally earned. You see what I'm saying? So, and your good works have to do with how nice it is for you there. You know, if you want really good room service and really good, really posh accommodations, you should sacrifice something now. So there's that way that good works can be considered important. So either unimportant and / dangerous, or only important but you earn it. What we're trying to say is neither of those is right, and the picture we should have of this should be deeper and richer and more, I think, more beautiful. And that is, this is what it means to be like God. Is to be joined in the communion. This is, I mean, I don't think that what we're saying here is antithetical to the notion of beatific vision. That's going to be what we're foretaste now, the works of piety, the true worship, and the works of mercy and justice. Well, what we're doing now with both of those is just a foretaste. And we're just glimpsing that. We're just starting to taste that. This is the first fruits, but it's not a sense of like you earn everything, salvation and the whole business, or you earn the good, the nice condo, better than your neighbors because you were nicer now. To read good works as either of those views is to really miss the point that I think Scripture is trying to teach us. Is we get to do this. Yes, they're necessary, but the point is that as we're drawn into God's own life, so we see our neighbor, love of God and love of neighbor, works of piety and works of mercy. It's just what it means to belong to God, because that's, in a sense, what it means for God to be God. If that sounds preachy, I kind of apologize. But I'll just say this. Bringing this up might be a mistake because it's still hard for me to talk about. But I was in Wilmore, Kentucky. Some of you, I think, traveled there. But I was there during February, and I was on both sides of the street. I was in Hughes Auditorium, and I was all over the campus grounds. And to see people worship, to be able to join in worship, in a moment where time and eternity seem to come together, people would say they were in that chapel for 15 hours straight because they didn't want to be anywhere else. One of the songs that was that came through again and again there was, "For endless day," had this refrain, "For endless days we will sing God's praise." And I know myself enough to know that if I would have heard that chorus too many times in a row a month earlier, I probably would have been, okay, this is starting to seem like endless days. In that moment, I clearly remember thinking, that won't be too many. And so when we're talking about good works, we're talking about good works of piety, of worship. And it's just to be able to do that, to be able to do those good works. It's what we're made for. It's what we're created for. It's what we're saved for. But those go with good works to others, what are traditionally called works of mercy. And those go together to see that. And by the way, in that context, also to see people, world-class New Testament scholars, 2 a.m. carrying toilet paper around for people. Eager to serve, happy to do good works in that way. Again, I think it's just the slightest foretaste. But I think that this echoes what Caleb is saying so well, is that this isn't an exception. It's not a preamble. It's not get the hard stuff out of the way so we can do so we don't have to do anything later. This is but this is what we're made for. Works of worship and works of piety. Where we worship and then we worship God and we worship together. This is just what it means to belong to God.
Wayne, if there's anybody that has one more question. Okay, there are quite a few.
right, so I'm a PK, a pastor's kid, and grew up in a pastor's home. My father's non-denominational, mainly towards Baptist, Presbyterian. People think I'm apostolic Pentecost. I don't know, but only because God has taken me elsewhere. He taught me some other things. But I grew up and I saw a lot of people working for God, just pouring themselves out. Work, work, work. And that was, and it was good. It was good. But my question is, was it the best? Was that actually what God wanted them to do? Because I saw so many of them get wore out. I got so many of them, burn out. And actually a couple of them I know of no longer go to church because of it. I'm just saying, what is more important? Is the relationship with God, or is it the works? I would submit that the work is the relationship, the pursuit of Him. And out of that comes the works, because it is His strength that comes through us and out. It's none of our strength that is used, and we're not wore out. And every bit of what we do is worth it, is what He wants, and it's His work. I'm not saying that we don't do work, but I think it's Him that does it through us. That's my question. Or what do you guys think? Sorry.
I think one of the beautiful things that we find as we explore this concept of God's grace or God's gift in the New Testament is that not only does the gift involve forgiveness, right, a change of status, it also involves empowerment, and that we've received the gift of the Spirit, right? And the Spirit empowers us to do these works. So it's not like God gives us the gift and says, okay, you're on your own. Part of the gift is Him continuing to dwell in us and to work through us. I think also it's important to recognize that faith is important. And I have an extended discussion of faith and my treatment of Paul in the book. But I think we need to see faith as our response, right? So when we're doing good, we're responding to what God has already done. And I think also one thing that can help us to avoid that thing of getting worn out, right, is remembering that the greatest commandment is love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, right? The second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. I think usually when we get worn out, though, it's not because we've been doing too many acts of or works of piety, right? We've been loving God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength too much. It's because we haven't been doing that, and we've been doing things on this level and forgetting about this angle, right? So I think if we can keep those greatest commandments together, then that will help us to avoid that issue.
Sorry. I thought my voice was loud enough. I would submit that the relationship is the most important. I believe, and that's my experience as well, is just pursuit of Him. And out of that comes so much good.
Okay. Is there another? Or someone waiting? I was just going to give us a standing break and come back at 3 o'clock, and then we have time to finish and ask more questions. So take a stretch. And I want to say at the end, we'll have a place for book signing and purchasing books if you would like after the conference. Thank you.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, but he's had a lot of interchange with the people from United.
Yeah, yeah. I know David Watson pretty well and stuff. So yeah. Oh, sure. Yeah, good. Yeah, good.
Yes, he's the chair of the theology department. Okay, if you'll use the next minute to gravitate toward your seats, we'll start again. Time to tie things up and begin to gravitate to your seats. Okay, we're going to go to our third and final part and have some more questions and tie things up. I do want to say again, you can get a paperback copy of the Doctrine of Good Works out in the lobby at the table, and it's $5 off the price of what it would be if you could get it. So I hope that's a benefit to you to take it home, and I hope you'll take the time to read. I talk to pastors, and that's one of the things they fight for is just time to read, but you can take the time, and when you take the time, I think the substantive thoughts of the people you're reading will be a ballast for what you're saying and ministering to the people. So, well, Daddy Friedemann is the last one. I was privileged to be at Wesley Biblical Seminary during the time our children, who are similar to the age of his oldest children, but we were all family growing up together. And so when I say Daddy Friedemann, my daughters would resonate with that almost more than Dr. Friedemann, Professor of Evangelism. So there's a warm fellowship here. But Dr. Friedemann is not least among the princes of Judah. He's going to come, and he's going to finish, and he'll do the job. So won't you welcome him to the platform?
Thank you, sir. One of the dear friends of my life. I love Ron Smith, and we've enjoyed so many good times together. And one of the great privileges of my life has been writing a book with these two individuals. Of course, I wasn't a major professor at Tom's, but I was a professor when he went to Wesley Biblical Seminary. I think you babysat Caleb, did you not? See? So we are so connected, it's incredible. And then, of course, we're standing at a meeting a couple years ago, and he says, man, it seems like the whole thing of works has been so weaponized. He says, it's just crazy. And then he looks over and says, how would you like to write a book with me on works? I said, well, let me fast and pray about it. I said, no, man, let's do it, all right? And so a couple years later, he says, hey, let's morph Caleb into the project. Well, I think, oh, that's so great. This will be fun. So whether it's fun or not, we did it, and we're excited about it. I'm going to suggest to you, first off, in answer to a question a moment ago about the fellowship of Jesus and all this, which I think is huge. One of the things that you recognize in the Old Testament, and Dr. Oswald, I think, has articulated that in the last few days, and he articulated in a festschrift that we put together for Alan Coppage years ago, and that was the word walk is huge in the Old Testament. It's a discipleship term, I think. It's one of the key discipleship terms of they walk with God. And if you could take that and say, okay, isn't that interesting that Jesus says, follow me, which is just another way to say, walk with me. And it's amazing what happens once he says that in the Gospel of Matthew in particular. In the 4th chapter, hey guys, come walk with me, follow me. The next thing that happens is he goes out and he teaches and he preaches and he heals. And he runs out to the untouchables, to the unclean of his culture, to people no one else would go to, and says, we're going to touch them. We're going to love them. We're going to heal them. And that's what it means to be a disciple, is to engage with Jesus, in fellowship with Jesus, in acts of mercy. Now, we believe that about acts of piety as well. But truly, in acts of mercy is where you see so much of the gospel spent. Having said that, I think it's important that in Matthew 25, when Jesus says, inasmuch as you've done it to the least of these, you've done it unto me. And that was Jesus talking. So there's a special fellowship there. There's a special presence there. There's something there that's so supernatural and so wonderful and so great. And I would say that John Wesley agreed with Luther, and Luther agreed with John Wesley to say that is a heaven-hell passage. It sounds like it there, and Caleb does a great job in the book of talking through that passage to where most Christians from most of Christian history would agree with the perspective of, yes, that's so essential for us that we need to be working with Jesus and ministering to Jesus in the poor, in the oppressed, in the disenfranchised. So, I think there is a scandal that we could suggest about a non-working Christianity. We've suggested that in the first part of the book, but something's gone wrong with Christianity. People are not attracted to something where we are not living out what we say is supposed to be happening. One of our favorite terms is, let's be love. Let's go ahead and be love. But if we think love is a thought or just a feeling, we miss it altogether. Love is something you do. And we've got to be doers of love, and that means all the better if we're doers of love to the poor and to the needy. That's who Jesus went to. That's who John Wesley went to throughout Christian history. That's who they went to say, this is who we need to minister to. It's so incredibly important, not just for the poor, it's incredibly important for us. So we recognize that. Now, I've got a friend named Joel Hemakumar. Sat down. We'll talk about this in the book just a very brief moment. Sat down with him at Moe's in Jackson, Mississippi. He was there visiting, and I said, Joel, you live in India. Tell me, what's the greatest barrier to Christian revival across India? What's the greatest barrier to that revival? He didn't even blink. He said, audio-visual problems. And of course, I'm thinking technology. That's how we think, right? What? He says, audio-visual problems. What they hear us saying, they're not seeing us doing. They hear us, they don't see it. And Christianity has got to be heard and seen and felt. Now, Stanley Jones had what he called Christian roundtables. He talks about a Christian roundtable meeting. He says, in Christian roundtables, what you're supposed to do is everyone speak to their experience. Now, some Christians will be there. About a third of the crowd was always Christians. But you'd bring in all kinds of perspectives, Hindus and Islam, and everybody's supposed to share their religious perspective. How's it working out for you with what you got going in religion? And Stanley Jones says, never once have we ever done a religious roundtable where the Holy Spirit wasn't in control of the meeting thereafter. No one criticized anybody's perspective. You just said, thank you for sharing. Thank you very much. And you move to the next person. There was a gentleman that says, hey, you all Christians say that Jesus has saved you. Well, as Jesus has saved you, so Krishna has saved me. He was a Brahmin. And so the leader of the meeting says, hey, thanks for that. And after the meeting says, listen, we are going to go down now to the outcast quarters, and we're going to go serve the poor. We're going to go minister their needs. We're going to go love them. We're going to touch them and let them know that they've got hope. Will you come with us? And the Brahmin says, Sahib, I'm saved, but I'm not saved that far. And that's a good bit, if not most, of Christianity today. We're saved, but we're not saved that far. Not so far as we're willing to take works of piety and works of mercy seriously, and works of mercy in particular regularly. Jesus said, let your light so shine before men in such a way that they might see your good works and glorify the Father who is in heaven. And I think that's the key to revival in America. If Americans, if the West, if the world doesn't see it, they're not going to come. They've got to see Christianity in motion. They've got to see love in action. And I think the West really isn't rejecting faith. I don't think they're really rejecting Christianity. I think they're rejecting a non-working faith, and it's the non-working faith that we have. And so, what do we do about it? It's a good bit about what we do at the end of the book. We look at churches that work. First off, what we found is they're not the norm. This is what we were trying to find. Churches that had 20% of their people doing something outside the church, evangelism or just works of mercy. And, of course, we were working mostly the works of mercy, but we were willing to say evangelism fine too. So how many can we find churches that are doing that? And I'm going to tell you, it was hard to find those churches. Because think about it, 20%. I don't know how many you have in your church, but 20%, if you got 100, it's 20 people. If you've got 10,000 people, that's 2,000 people a week. And I'm going to tell you, mega churches, almost no way they can do it. The best shot at doing this are going to be smaller to middle-sized churches that say, this is going to be a goal of ours. We're going to make it happen by God's grace over the next 5 years. We're going to work at it until it happens. And y'all, if we think that this is necessary for salvation, it's a project worth working on. I don't think most of us are convinced it's worth working on. But I love what Tom said just a moment ago. Y'all, this is the abundant life. It's not just we're saying, hey, you don't do it, you go to hell. Hey, if you don't do it, something's gone wrong with your Christianity. Hey, it's necessary for salvation, so suck it up. This is the good life, y'all. I can tell you, I've got a congregation that substantially are doing these things. And the happiest people in the congregation are the people who are doing it. The people who are going to the abortion clinic, the people who are going to the nursing homes, the people who are going to the prison, people who are going to the needy elementary school we've got going, having a Bible club for them. Those are the happiest people in our church. And by the way, they're also the good givers in our church. And by the way, they're also the ones that if I ever plant a church, that's who I'm going to plant a church with. These are truly the salt and the light of the world. So we ask the question, when it happens, what kind of churches make it happen? And the first thing there is simply this. The pastor has to lead. Now, if you got a pastoral team, the pastoral team has to lead. That is, we teach about it, we preach about it, but we also do it. Listen, this is what we want to do. I know we want to do it. We want to say, hey, I'm not here to do it. I'm here to equip you to do it. Yeah, that's right. That's what I want to do. I want to equip you all to do it. I don't really want to go out to the prison. I sure shouldn't want to go out to the abortion clinic. I mean, no. I'm going to teach you to do it. Y'all, that doesn't work. The pastor's got to lead. The pastor's got to get up and go. And I would say probably for a period of about 6 months, go alone if you have to. But then say, now, let me take a couple people along with me. And then start reporting what you're doing. And start asking other people to join you. And by the way, start other ministries too. It's not the only thing we do here, prison ministry or the Bible club or abortion clinic ministry. You want to do a ministry? We want you to do ministry. What's an idea you have? Run it past us. We'll try to help you all we can. But it's preachers who teach, preach, and lead. I think you need to help ministry starts and facilitate those. I think you need a strong lay leadership. Most of the ministries at my church, most of the ministries I hear about when churches are asked, how you doing it, their lay leaders are leading. And I think you pastors, most of you would agree with this, maybe not. They're better at almost everything anyway. I mean, do I hear any amens to that? They're better at almost everything anyway. So let them lead. Now, I say there ought to be some rules and some helps, and we'll even equip. But on the whole, almost every ministry we've got going in our church and every ministry of churches that we talked about was started by a serious layperson that said, may I? And the good pastors will not say, you don't have the training yet. The good pastors will say, hey, let's get a team together and let's help you go. And we facilitate their movement. Also, I think their celebration. Whatever you celebrate proliferates. Whatever you celebrate proliferates. Now, some churches don't celebrate anything, and and guess what? Nothing's proliferating. But I think whatever you celebrate proliferates, and this is going to be one of the key things. If you've got heroes in your congregation that are doing heroic things, you need to swing a T-shirt during announcement time. Get them on up there. Hoot and howl for them. Lay your hands on them, pray for them. That's the kind of stuff that makes other people want to get in and do it with you. Francis Schaeffer said, biblical orthodoxy without compassion is surely the ugliest thing in the world. But that's most of what our educational institutions want to do, get you thinking right. But y'all, it's never going to be enough. And that's why I always encourage my professorial colleagues to hay regardless. It's not just the practical end of the professorial group, not just those guys, but all the folks, the biblical guys, the theology guys. Everybody needs a ministry, and take some students along with you to the ministry. And if our educational institutions would start doing that, there might be some hope other places. So we need to take that seriously in our schools. But regardless of whether our schools take it seriously or not, we as pastors need to take that seriously and go and bring people along and equip them for this kind of human flourishing. I ran across this little piece of research while we were doing the book. It was called the Christian cul-de-sac. Cul-de-sacs, I don't know, anybody here live on a cul-de-sac? Anybody? The cul-de-sacs are just kind of, you got a major road here, and then you go off the road, and then there's a nice little circle. And city planners started using those, figuring they're safe for kids. That'll be a great, safe place for people to be in. City planners largely have stopped doing cul-de-sacs. They don't do them much anymore, and the reason they don't plan to do them much anymore is they found out that more kids died in the cul-de-sac than died out on the busy street. Because you're thinking, hey, everything's safe here? Let me just put it in reverse, whip out of here, and you hit a kid. And they stopped making cul-de-sacs. And this is the point. Do we, and are we guilty of, making Christian cul-de-sacs out of our churches? Never knowing the damage we're causing because we're trying to make safe places for people. And I'm going to suggest to you, Christianity was never meant to be put in a safe place. That's never been where we have flourished. We go and run to the sound of the pain. And wherever there's pain, we ought to be found there. And even if you do live on a Christian cul-de-sac, I'd get those people together and say, now let's go find some place. The busy road, the busy street, the inner city. Let's go to places that desperately need people like us. And if we don't, there's two things that will happen. Lots of needs won't be taken care of out there, and we die. Now, who said that? I don't know if you ever heard of a guy named John Wesley. John Wesley had a great sermon called 98 on visiting the sick. And he used the sick as a metaphor. He was using Matthew 25. And as much as you've done to the least, the sick is one of those. You need to make sure that you're taking the sick seriously. Now, it wasn't simply the sick. He says he used it for metaphor for anybody with great need outside the church. And he wanted every Methodist to have a regular ministry of visiting the sick. Every Christian to have a regular ministry of getting outside your congregation and going to work on literacy issues, or going to work in a prison, or going to work outside an abortion clinic. He said every Christian has to do this. And this is what he said. You cannot maintain your salvation without a ministry like that. You will not go on to entire sanctification without a ministry like that. You will not keep your entire sanctification without a ministry like that. And you will not go to glory without a ministry like that. Yeah, he said it. Sermon number 98, and he got lots of other teachings just like that in his writings. And all I want to say is, and I get back to what Tom said, this is the good life. This is the good life. You think, man, it sounds like work. It sounds messy. I'll tell you real quick, it is messy. Oh my goodness, is it messy? Oh my goodness, is it messy? I'm dealing with some issues this week in my church. I need to be home right now because I just feel like the church is discombobulated right now over an issue. And it's an issue that kind of is related to this old stuff. It's messy, y'all. To do this means if you want a church that's not messy, then this isn't the stuff for you. Works. Just stay out of it. Stay away from it. Go make your cul-de-sac and just be happy being away. Because if you're going to do this, and so one of our churches up in Colorado says, man, I'm preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. I'm up there, and I look up, and I see there's a fight over the coffee jar out there in the foyer. And it's hard to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ when you got two guys fighting over the coffee jar. One guy's a homeless guy, came in, saw the dollar bills and grabbed for him, and another one of our guys said, can't do that. And there we go. They're fighting out there. And all he could say about all that scenario was, It's messy. And it is. Works are messy. But they're good. They're necessary. There's no heaven without them. Amen.
Matt. John Oswalt once, he has something that he would like to share that's been very provocative for him in thinking about the subject. And in chapel this morning, after years and years, John Oswalt first taught me in 1978. I called him the GOAT. Now, everybody knows what that is in the football, and the kids all know what that is, the youth, you know. But he said, what is the GOAT? You know what the GOAT is? Greatest of all time. I think that's Oswald, and I'm going to turn the mic over to him for a little bit.
Thank you. Number one, thank you, three guys. Wow, this was good. This was good. Thank you. Thank you. I wanted to respond to that question on when did this present apostasy begin? I think it began with a reaction against the social gospel. And the social gospel was a reaction against the holiness movement. 1867, Vineland, camp meeting for holiness. And in the next 20 years, something like 1,000 camp meetings sprung up. Holiness for God, holiness for Jesus. And what began to happen is the holiness people began to lose the social aspect. You've done it to the least of these. We lost it. We were focusing on us being holy. And the result was a lot of Methodists said, wait a minute. We've got to reach the least and the last. But what they did is unplug it from the relationship. And there was the social gospel. Well, they linked it to a liberal philosophy, and fundamentalism sprang up. We're going to fight that stuff. We're going to fight it tooth and nail. Thank God for the fundamentalists. I is one. But in the process, then, they went to the other extreme. And the result was where we are today. And again, both Tom and Caleb and Matt have laid it out. We're the enemy for a lot of North American evangelicalism. And, well, we don't have time to fight that stuff. We need to be out there with the least and the lost. But I really think that's where it began. I really think it began in 1910, 1920. Because we lost it in 1880 and 1890. And they reacted, and there it was. So anyway, that's a view of a non-historical, non-theologian.
Fundamentalist I is it.
Any other questions? Yes.
I don't really have a question. I have a comment. I'm not from this county. I facilitate, this will be our fifth Saturday, I facilitated a dinner church for the homeless. And there's 10 churches involved. I hope people don't get the wrong idea of works, because people come, they bring food. They stand over there. The homeless sit at tables with nice tablecloths, table decorations, and they serve them and they go back and stand, and they've done their good works. I'm trying to get them more involved to come. Honey, how's it going? How's your day been? How's your week been? You got something to eat for tomorrow? Okay? I'm trying touch, compassion.
Amen.
And I hope people, when you go out to do good works, it's not us and them. Except for the grace of God, there go I.
Thank you. Good word. Excuse me, there's a Diane Leclerc once said that quit telling me about the fact that you love poor people. Tell me about the names of the poor people you love. You say you love poor people, tell me their names. It doesn't help us to do it generically, and Wesley said it doesn't help just to give money. Most of us think good works is giving money. That's not good work. I mean, that's going to be a work of piety, but the work of mercy is you need to be getting your hands dirty somewhere and getting to know some names. Names like Thomas, Timothy, Jamaron, Sherman, Marcus, John, Carl. These are guys on Tuesday night I said, you make sure you write your first name down because I'll pray for you every day until we see each other again on Sunday. Y'all, this is our job. Know some names, get to some relationships with, and what we know about poverty is relationships are the key. Thank you.
Okay, won't you thank our authors again, and they're going to meet you. Matt? Yep. At 3:30, we're going to meet the authors in the back. So you got 4 minutes.
All right, here we go. Thank you, Matt. Matt's a huge pro-lifer, and thank you for your work on that across many years. So 38 years ago, 2 Wesley Biblical Seminary students showed up outside the abortion clinic, and they've been there every month, every year, and sometimes every day until Roe v. Wade got overturned and our clinic shut down. Our school used to be, Wesley Biblical Seminary used to be right next to a ladies' home named Beverly Smith. Beverly Smith opened up the first abortion clinic in Mississippi. She remembers one day when some Wesley Biblical Seminary students were told for a grade they need to go evangelize. So they're knocking on Dr. Beverly Smith's door. They share the gospel with her, and part of her story is that made a difference. I eventually came to Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, and she served on the board of Wesley Biblical Seminary in time. So that's kind of the cool part of the story, but the fact of the matter is what really mattered there, Matt, was across many years, there was just this continual pressure. We would take students out with us. In order to get an A in this class, you need to go with us either to the prison or out to the abortion clinic. And so one day, we're out there at the abortion clinic, and someone says, Dr. Friedemann, you need to come with me. There's someone that probably needs to talk to you. So what we were doing, I probably was there with Caleb. We were outside what we call the gates of hell. And on the other side of that glass doorway, they're doing abortions. So we sing hymns. We try to be loving. We're not yelling at anybody. We're not being jerks. We're just trying to offer women a choice. We are the pro-choicers. Those women are going in there, they don't think they have a choice. We want to say, you have a choice. So they came and got me, and I said, oh, so someone wants to talk? Yeah. So take me to this young lady, about so high, and I'm dumb as a rock. I don't know what to say when someone's about ready to get an abortion. I don't know what to do. I've made up some lines. Let us help you love your baby. We'll do anything. We'll even raise the kid. Something before they go get the abortion. But here's one that has already paid her $200. She's going to come back in 2 days and get the abortion. She's looking at me, and I said, what's your name? She shares her name. Let's call her Grace. My name's Grace. I said, You doing okay? Well, not really. And I look down. She has a blue armband around her wrist. I said, do you know what that means? And she goes, I don't know what that means. Because on her wristband it said Jehovah Jireh. I said, sweetheart, that means God provides. Where's your car? She showed me her car. I said, let me walk you to your car, make sure you're safe. So I'm walking along with her, and I said, you're kind of scared right now. She goes, yes. I said, you haven't told your guy yet, have you? She goes, no. Haven't told your mom or dad yet, have you? She goes, no. Haven't told your pastor or your Sunday school teacher? No. I said, okay, let me tell you what's going to happen. You're going to get in this car that we're standing by right there, and you're going to get in, and you're going to drive away, and you're never coming back to this place ever again. And let me say that when you go tell your guy in that moment, I don't know what he'll do. He might flip out. He might run away. But whatever he does in that moment, God will provide. He's Jehovah Jireh. I said, then you're going to go tell your mom and dad, and that's going to be one of the hardest discussions you've ever had. And you're going to tell them what's happened and that you're with child. And I don't know what they're going to do or say, but in that moment, Jehovah Jireh. Then you're going to go tell your pastor, and then your Sunday school teacher, and then your friends. And I have no idea what their reaction's going to be. But when you tell them, Jehovah Jireh. So she got in her car, and outside the abortion clinic, you never hear anything back again. They're so embarrassed they were over there. If they saved their child, if they didn't save their child, they're not going to tell you. So you never hear back much. But about 6 years later, I got a Facebook message, and I clicked on it. She goes, Dr. Friedemann, Grace here. You won't remember me, but I was the girl with the blue armband. And by the way, you were right. I told my boyfriend and Jehovah Jireh. I told my pastor, Jehovah Jireh. I told mom and dad, I thought I was done for, but Jehovah Jireh. But can I tell you about the joy of my life? He's 6 years old. Man, does he ever love chocolate, and man, does he ever hate vegetables. He's the joy of my life. Not longer after he was born, I met a young man who was going to med school. He's a doctor now. He grabbed me up and loves my child at least as much as I do. It's because I was a scared kid that just paid $200 to get an abortion, and you told me that he would provide Jehovah Jireh. Now that has happened. It happened, Matt, 1,000 times when our church, Day Spring Community Church, and our seminary, Wesley Biblical Seminary, was out there. We made it clear. I used to have a talk show and a radio talk show and a newspaper call. We made it clear you cannot be a Republican in this state and be pro-choice. We made it very clear. We'd run them out using the media. And so they came to the moment eventually where they passed a 15-week bill. It's not going to save a single life. And this abortion clinic owner blew a gasket. After 38 years of pressure, she was sick and tired of it. And she says, we're taking it all the way to the Supreme Court. She lost her composure, Matt. And she lost her composure because of the regular drumbeat across years. Because from that group of people out in front of that clinic, legislators started getting involved. And pretty soon, you can't be elected to statewide office without being Republican. And pretty soon, they dared our Attorney General, take it to the Supreme Court. Let's see what happened. And she did. And we won. And it was my tall privilege to be outside of the abortion clinic taking pictures of a Ryder U-Haul, gathering up all this stuff, the utensils of death, putting him into the U-Haul and driving away. we're not going to save America in all likelihood from social disaster, but we might. They say that Wesley and his people, by doing these small works of mercy that grew into larger things, just like that abortion clinic thing, right? Small little thing that grew into a big thing. They say, and they still say, that Wesley and the Methodists put the toothpaste back in the tube and saved England from a French Revolution. Now that may be overspeak, and I get it, but there's no question about it. Any Christian historian will look at that moment and say something special happened. And didn't happen because of the bigwigs, it happened because of the people who were doing regular acts and works of mercy and doing them for the King. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. And thank you, Matt, for asking the question. Let's stand, and I'll just say a prayer asking God to send us forth. Thank you for coming our way. We want you to come our way again. We'll be in touch, announcing to you one of the next things that we have in a few months. I also want to say October the 12th is our 75th Diamond Anniversary Day from when our school was founded, 75 years. So we're going to have works of mercy, a Christian service day. All of our young people will be in service that day until afternoon, and then a free barbecue dinner for anyone that would like to come and join us. Then we're going to have a praise fest, a concert of praise right here from 6 o'clock till 7:30. And then to have a little fun, because hitherto we've come by God's grace. We're going to have a donkey basketball game in the gymnasium that night. Yes, on real donkeys. They tell me that they put sneakers on these donkeys because it protects the gym floor. That's a little beyond my pale. I want to say this, though. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. Would you come and join us as our guests just to help celebrate? We're looking forward to it. We're prepared for you. And we're trusting that God would really heighten our experience of joy together because you've come with us. Our Lord, we thank you for this day. We thank you for these three authors putting their heads, their hearts, their pens together in order that we might know afresh and anew in a newly equipped way that faith without works is dead, but faith that is genuine faith genuinely works. We love you, God. Now send us forward. May we be workers for the kingdom until the day of March comes and culminates when Jesus shall come again and see the travail of his soul and be satisfied. Amen.